Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Prisons and Probation Research Hub seminar. This is our fourth this last year that we're doing online, and it's just fantastic the numbers of people that we're attracting to our events. I'm absolutely delighted. I'm really, really, really pleased that today is going to feature Dr. Lucy Baldwin. And certainly for me and my colleagues, this is a celebration of Lucy. She's recently defended her PhD thesis on mothers in prison. And I think it's testament to Lucy that she's attracted over 170 guests today. I've been privileged enough to work with Lucy and observe and support Lucy on her journey with her research. And it has been a privilege. And using Lucy's phrase, I'm tickled pink that she's here today to talk about her research, but very importantly, how her work has created change, positive change for women that end up in the system, the criminal justice system, particularly prisons. I'm moved by Lucy's interviews with the mothers and the grandmothers that feature in her work, but especially Lucy's tenacity and her passion for this topic. And if you haven't heard Lucy speak about her work or have read any of her work, I'm sure you won't be disappointed. So thank you, Lucy. Let's also celebrate Lucy's great achievement. And over to Lucy.
Hey, well, that was an introduction and a half, wasn't it? Thank you very much, Vic. No,
I'm not making you cry, am I?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I've even tidied up my bookshelves a little bit. So today, I like Vic says, I am going to talk about my research, but Vic also wanted me to talk a little bit about my research journey. So apologies if you weren't interested in that bit, because you're going to get a little bit of that bit as well. But mostly, obviously, we'll be talking about the mothers and grandmothers that drive me forward. So yes, I am indeed now Dr. Lucy Baldwin. Sounds peculiar, but I'm very delighted. And I've been a senior lecturer at Montfort University for 17 years now. A long time. It is a long time, actually. And during that time, women and mothers in and after prison have long been my passion. And it's been a peculiar journey, I think, to get here. And there's it's relatively new to me. I haven't heard this term until very recently, about being called a pracademic. And you won't be surprised to learn that that's a combination of being a practitioner and an academic. And I think for me, it does kind of join together the areas of my life that are really important to me. I am so old, I have been in social and criminal justice for 33 years now. I qualified as a social worker and a probation officer, and I've worked in everything from residential social care, child and family psychiatry, to prisons, community settings, and I specialise most particularly in forensic mental health as a social worker and a probation officer. And I've always very much felt like I've had a foot in both camps, and that for me I think is a plus. Because you never lose. I think when you go into academia, if you've been a practitioner, you never really lose that practice focus, and you never lose that ability and desire, I think, to apply the knowledge, to apply whatever you're researching, and to think about it in terms of, you know, what can it do, where can it go, what can it do. And I think that's really important. So it's never lost, but I think importantly for those academics who don't start in practice, I think it can be found. And it really is just about application, and it's about thinking about applying your knowledge into practice. Like, how can it change things? Why does it matter? What is the so what of your research? And I think as a feminist researcher, particularly, where your research journey starts and what is relevant on that journey is really important. And for me, particularly personally, with the topics that I choose, there's nothing about my life that in some ways hasn't been relevant. And as that that chain of my life reveals, you know, I had, I suppose, a very rough start in life, fairly challenging childhood, and left home at 15 and became pregnant at 16, was a single parent at 18. I'm a mother to adults and now a grandmother. And every part of that journey has had relevance to my research and to my understanding of the women, and to my appreciation for some of the stigma and some of the challenges that women go through. I share an awful lot of the experiences that most women in prison have. And so that's not been lost on me, but it's in feminist research, particularly, reflexivity is essential. And I call it rolling reflexivity because quite often, you know, you see studies that call themselves feminist, but they don't necessarily do anything about that label in terms of the methodology or in terms of how the information is gathered and how it's disseminated and the visibility of participants in the research. And for me, it was really important that A, the welfare of my participants was paramount, and that informed some of my ethical care decisions, but B, that the women were involved in every single part of the research process, including its dissemination. And some of the women, you know, I'll be writing with and publishing with for years to come. But importantly, as well as the reflexivity in feminist research, it's important. I call it a rolling reflexivity. So it's important to have that all the way through, not just a great big wad of navel gazing right at the end where you look back and think, all right, what did that feel like? It needs to be something that you process all the way through and that you reflect on all the way through. And we don't have time to go into some of that today, but I've written about that elsewhere. And if people want to talk about that, it's a very interesting kind of sideline to the research that surprised me in some ways. But anyway, so all of those different stages of my life, and even becoming a grandma, and inconveniently all my children decided to breed while I was studying for my PhD. I waited, you know, until they'd all grown up and I would have more time, and then they all start having grandchildren to get in my way, beautifully get in my way. But it's like, how can I study when I've got to hold this gorgeous little thing? But anyway, but even that part of it was so important because it really made me recognise, not having had a supportive family or not having that extended family network, I didn't really have a massive understanding about the importance or the significance of grandparents or grandmothering, and the role that grandmothers can play in grandchildren's lives and mothers' lives, and how they play such an important role when their children grow up and have children. So it really helped me to include grandmothers in my research and made me realise just how disadvantaged grandmothers in prison can be just as much as mothers. We tend to focus on mothers of dependent children, but it doesn't just end there. I'm the mother of two nearly 40-year-old sons, and trust me, it doesn't end there. But I think the most important thing for me, and I know it's not necessarily possible for everybody, because sometimes we don't all have the luxury of being able to research exactly what we want, but wherever possible, and this certainly mattered to me, research your passion and have passion for your research and have passion for its purpose, because that is what sustains you when it's difficult. And doing it part-time with a family and a full-time job does make it difficult, but it's just so important. And I hope the fact that you're here, I guess, means that some of you at least are very interested in why this is important, and that warms the cockles of my heart, because it is important. And when we think about it, I have used this slide before, so apologies if anybody's seen it before, but why is motherhood important when we're talking about criminalised women? And it's important because as women, and obviously this happens to fathers too, and I'm not belittling anything around fatherhood, it just so happens that this presentation and my research focuses on women. I'm not diminishing the fatherhood role at all, but why motherhood is so important is because we are literally bombarded as women with images after image, message after message from time immemorial about how mothers should behave, how what a good mother looks like, what a bad mother looks like too, and how special that bond is, how mothers should be selfless and nurturing and give up absolutely everything for their children and be there at all times. But sometimes that reality, if you're living in a domestically abusive relationship after a childhood that was filled with nothing but addiction and abuse, if you're trying to manage in poverty, if you're on a 0 hours contract or 3 0 hours contract and you don't know what hours you're going to get next week, it's very difficult to be all things that we expect of mothers, and carry out that role to perfection. And as mothers, even mothers who are not criminalised, we live with guilt on a daily basis. We love them too much, not enough. We spend too much time with them, not enough time. We're a working mother, we're not a working mother, so we're not a good role. There's guilt thrown at women who are mothers. And if for criminalised mothers, there's a hook, and there's a hook that they hang their bad motherhood from, and they wear it like a coat, and that has an impact on how they experience the criminal justice system and how they experience people who work with them in the criminal justice system. And Ursula, one of the mums in my research, said, being a mother, it's not all that I am, but it's the largest and most judged part of who I am. And I think that's very true. Hang on, I just need to get my mouse over to my other screen so it moves. So I'm not going to talk too long about statistics and context, because I think most of you who are here will probably know them, but they have a relevance. So we know that 66% of the female prison population are mothers, but that refers to children under 18. So it isn't actually an accurate figure. We don't actually know how many women in prison are mothers. We know that around 17 to 18,000 children and 13,000 mothers are separated annually. It's gone down in the last year somewhat, but it's still higher than it should be. We know that when a mother goes to prison, only 5% of children actually are able to stay in their own homes, whereas when a father goes to prison, 95% of children are able to stay in their own homes. Only 14% go directly into care, but imagine just that 95% are displaced out of their own homes. How disruptive is that? We know that over 50% of women have experienced abuse as a child and an adult. We know that there's a really high rate of self-harm. This figure in itself is quite shocking. We know that 46% of women in prison have previously attempted suicide. That's huge. So almost half of the women in prison have not wanted to live at some point in their life. So we know that women in prison are already a vulnerable population. They have experienced lots of vulnerabilities, but they're also strong, resilient women who have survived to get to that point. But we know that we have these experiences, women have these experiences. So imagine going through all of that, taking all of that to prison with you, and then on top of your mothering emotions. We know that for most women in custody, it's the first time they've been separated from their children for any length of time. And we know that most women will be many, many miles away from home. We know that many women, and far more than some people would have us believe, but I don't think I've ever gone into a prison and not met at least 2 women that this has happened to. But we know many mothers do not expect a custodial sentence and therefore are not able to prepare their children or themselves. They might have taken their children to school that morning and dropped their child off expecting to pick them up, not thinking or having explicitly been told that they wouldn't get a custodial sentence. And imagine what that feels like. Imagine going to prison, not even knowing who's going to pick your child up from school that day, because you can't just phone somebody and say, can you pick my child up? So imagine that when you're being received into custody. We know that most women in prison are in prison for either breach or short sentences, or they've been criminalised through poverty or trauma, and that we know that most women in prison are in for short periods. So we have all of that trauma that most women have already brought to prison on top of their mothering emotions. So we're talking about women who can very often have very complex needs, and their motherhood is a need, and it is a need that is until very, very recently had not been factored into any kind of support work with women in custody. And we know that so many women in prison are pregnant, and managing a pregnancy in prison is challenging and frightening and dangerous, and that's something we want to avoid, but we'll get down to that later on. But understanding the emotions, understanding that layer of complexity, and actively working with that layer of complexity for mothers is really important to working successfully and effectively with mothers. Because if you imagine being a mother in prison and receiving a phone call, for example, from, I don't know, your 13-year-old child who's being bullied at school, and so she's talking about self-harming, and these are things that I've taken from my research, and she's talking about self-harming, she's talking about killing herself because she's being bullied at school because you as a mother are in prison. And then you get a knock on your cell door and somebody says, right, it's your sentence planning meeting now, can you come? And that mother, all she can do is think about her child. Is their child safe? How can she help? What can she do? Imagine that feeling of powerlessness if your child is out there hurting and you can't do anything. But now you're supposed to go into a sentence planning meeting. That's not going to happen, is it? And women talk to me about how they would become angry because they were so frustrated, or they would become suicidal because they were in emotional agony. And that isn't recognised and supported, which means women don't want to, can't, aren't able to engage in sentence planning or engage in rehabilitation work. So it affects the level of engagement women are able to engage in, and it affects the level of support women are able to access, and it affects how people can work with them. And understanding that and recognising that is really important, because one mum, well, more than one mum, came off the phone to her child and stood there and said, I just wanted to start a fight. I just wanted to start a fight because I had no idea what to do with my emotions. I had no idea how to cope with them or where to put them. And she would have been relieved if something had kicked off. She did resist starting something, but she wasn't, other mums didn't, and other mums would go in their cells and self-harm. And it matters from the very first day. Not recognising somebody's motherhood is risky, it's dangerous, and it's harmful. Mothers would talk to me about feeling suicidal immediately they got into prison, because that wrench, that separation was mind-numbingly painful. Jaspreet says, going to prison as a mother is, I think, the worst thing. I genuinely can't think of anything worse as a mother to do to your children. I felt like I was watching it as if it was someone else. I was numb with shock, but at the same time, all I could think about was my children. Mavis, who was very posh and very lovely, very eloquent in her words, said, I must admit that I did have very negative thoughts. I'm ashamed to admit that it crossed my mind to take my life. Obviously I didn't. And Rita talks about, at that point, I would have given up all access to the rest of my family, even my own mum, for that one visit from my children. I didn't feel I could function without seeing them. For the first time in my life, I considered self-harm for no other reason than I had no idea how to handle the pain. Annie talks about how she felt like a rubbish mom and how she felt like she was the worst mom in the world because of what she'd put her child through. And Queenie talks about being compared to the other grandma in the family and how that makes her feel. And like I said earlier, that being a criminalized woman, being a criminalized mother, gives the mothers a hook on which to hang their shame and blame. And they are so self-punishing and self-critical that when they feel it from other officers or from people who respond to them, some of the women had comments from judges that were nothing short of cruel. They were just horrific, some of the things that judges said specific to their motherhood. But it could be even things that are less obvious that make a difference. Like one mum, Dee, went to prison and she had 4 children, and she went into custody and met an officer who did actually ask about her children. And trust me, it doesn't always happen, sadly, but it did on this occasion. But the officer said to her, "You've got 4 children." Now, what she heard was, "You're a terrible mother. You should have thought about your children. You've got 4 children and you've still let them down to come here," just because of the way that person spoke. Whereas if the person had simply said, "How many children do you have? What are their names? Where are they cared for?" That makes a huge difference. So even basic things about how we speak to women has an impact on the level of internalized shame and blame that they will take on, as well as the shame and blame that they're layering onto themselves that is just being left to fester and nothing's being done with it. And that has an intersectionality to it as well, with class, with age, with race. Katie, who was a black woman in my research, she had a black probation officer, and her probation officer said to her, "You haven't just let mothers down, you've let your race down. We expect more. You have lived up to a stereotype." And Katie said to me she felt terrible as not only as a mother but as a black mother. And all of this intersectionality has to be explored and it has to be examined, because the impact is huge and the impact is long lasting. The main themes from my doctoral research, although there's other research that kind of informs and feeds into it, but the main themes from my doctoral research were to do with before prison. The women identified, and it won't surprise anybody who has any knowledge in this field, that poverty, especially poverty and mental health, were really interlinked and were really evident in the women's pre-prison histories, as were abuse, trauma and addiction. But what was really strong as well was the fact that the mothers had really negative experiences of their own childhood, in terms of they hadn't been mothered well, or they'd been neglectfully mothered, and not necessarily, and the blame doesn't lie when you look at the examination of it. It's not necessarily, it's not the mother's individual faults. The level of poverty and trauma that was intergenerational was so evident, which really revealed just a multitude of missed opportunities from multiple agencies. I mean, I'll talk to you a little bit about Mary. Mary was a mum who, she'd had an awful childhood. She'd lived with an alcoholic mum who had been forced into prostitution, and Mary had been kind of adopted into that life and was part of it, but made to be part of it. Mary unsurprisingly left home, but because of her trauma and because of her lack of support, she ended up in abusive relationships and almost repeating a pattern. She became pregnant to an abusive person who forced her into offending, and Mary went into prison. Her first child went into care. Mary came back out, got that child out of care, but then again repeated the cycle because there was no support, there was no input. Mary then had another child and again was forced into offending. This is a really short version. Mary's written a chapter with me that if anybody wants me to send to them, you can email me and I'll send it to you. And it's got Mary's full story, which is horrific. But Mary, told by her, not me. And Mary then had another cycle and of prison. And at this point, she decided that her children were better off without her. So she gave up her parental rights because she felt so worthless and pointless. These are her words, not mine. She felt worthless and pointless as a mother that she genuinely believed that her children would be better off without her. And she had this vision that they would be growing up then in Crouch End, she thought, with a brother called Charles, and would have a lovely life. The tragedy was her children didn't. They grew up in care. Her boys ended up being career criminals. They then had difficulties with their own children and couldn't bond with their own children. So you've got 3 generations who were affected because of the missed opportunities to support Mary as a child and to support Mary's mother and to intervene. And that was really strong. The structural failures and the multiple failures that all of the women experienced at various different stages was horrific. And in prison, I'm trying to talk fast now because I'm seeing we're running out of time. The early days were really challenging, and there were officers who genuinely saved mothers' lives by just spending time with women who did not feel they could get through those first days and that initial separation. Those early days were really difficult, and there were some of the days where things like contact were harder, reception phone calls weren't given, lots of things that made that complicated. And there were lots of things about the prison regimes and rules that really added to the mother's trauma, and not least was the open and closed. It's ridiculous in this country that we have so many women who were in prison for non-violent offences, yet 10 out of our 12 prisons are closed prisons. It's absolutely ridiculous, and those closed conditions have a huge impact on how the mothers interact with each other, how they can see their children, how the visits are undertaken. Mothers in closed conditions are far more reluctant to support each other because they don't like to ask questions, because they don't know the other women as well and they don't know their circumstances, so they don't want to trigger anything. But in open conditions, mothers are much more able to support each other. Things like that matter. How staff engage with women matters, whether their motherhood is addressed or supported. One mum told me that she had been planning to take her life, and one officer asked, the officer knew that it was her child's birthday and remembered the child's name and happened to ask and say, "How is Alfie?" And that stopped her from taking her life because somebody just remembered her child's name. It's the little things that made the hugest of difference. Post-prison, the mothers, some of my mothers were 46 years post-release. Most of them were more than 5 years post-release, and all of them were suffering. All of them described an ongoing trauma. And for some of the mothers, particularly those who now had adult children, whose children were now having children, they'd got to a place where they thought they were peaceful, where they thought their family was peaceful, where they thought that they'd not got over it but had come to live with what had happened. But then as the grown-up children become mothers or become fathers, then a whole other layer of judgment came. And you know, you had daughters and sons who were saying, well, how could you do that? How could you do that to me? So for the grandmothers especially, there were these layers of shame. And I think it was Mavis who called them that, layers of shame that just kept coming back. And every time they thought the past was behind them, it was back. And the women genuinely described PTSD. Not only from the trauma that they'd experienced before prison, but from the trauma of prison, from the trauma of being separated from their children and not being able to mother. They described living in penance and wanting to have to make it up to their children in a way that they never could. So they were forever climbing a mountain that just didn't have a top. You know, they felt unable to engage in discipline with their children. Some mothers spoilt their children because they wanted to make it up to them. Other mothers tried to be heavier on discipline to try and so their children didn't make what they classed as the same mistakes that they did. It changed the mothers forever. There's always this perception that, and mothers have it, mothers described having it, you know, that once I get out, it'll be fine. And yet the reality is it really wasn't fine. It was a long way from fine for all of the mothers. But the hardest thing was that the mothers had no support. None of them on probation were ever asked about how it was going. one of the mums had 4 years in prison and 4 years on licence, and nobody ever asked her how it was going as a mother. And she had 5 children that were her first, last and every thought. And nobody asked her how they were. Nobody asked her what it was like to renegotiate her place back into the family, and that was all she was bothered about. Everything else fell away. And that is something that all of the mothers described, how they really struggled. And that had a massive impact on their desistance, because for some of the mothers really they were trying to manage old trauma as well as new trauma. And for some of the mothers, that had a risk, that there were risks around that with addiction, because if they didn't have that support around their motherhood, then there was those temptations to cope in the way they'd previously coped, which was through addiction. And that, for some of the mothers, was the only way to deal with their pain and failure that they felt as mothers. And so then they might fall back into that addiction to escape that pain, which obviously led to offending, which led to more separation, which led to more guilt, which led to more offending. So you have a cycle that was impossible for some of the mothers to escape from. And for some of the mothers, it was impossible to escape from. And for some of the mothers, it had absolutely devastating consequences in terms of being returned to prison, or returning to offending, or returning into addiction. And they felt like they could never be trusted again. They felt like nobody trusted them to mother, like there was a suspicion that was there all of the time, not just from the state, but from families. Some grandmothers who had been caregivers for the children didn't want to give the children back. And although there might not be any reasons for the grandmothers to necessarily keep the children with them, they would say to the mothers, well, they're not coming back. Or sometimes children who had disrupted lives didn't want to come back. And managing all of that as somebody who feels like you're not good enough anyway makes that very difficult to challenge. But the trauma was the thing that was, I think, probably the most significant in terms of what the women had gone through. It just didn't end, and it was so impactful in terms of how they coped and how they helped their children cope. But one of the things that never ceases to amaze me about women in general, but particularly criminalised women, is their strength and their resilience. And so many of the women in my research wanted to take on a role where they would support other women who had gone through those experiences. It's called the wounded healer phenomena, apparently. And so many of the women went on to work with other women, to support other women, to volunteer in other situations with other women. And we don't recognise that as a resource as often as we should. We don't recognise the knowledge, the understanding, the experience that mothers and women who've been to prison bring and could bring to policy, to practice, to developing, to the drives for change. And we need to encourage that far more than we already do. And we need to recognise those experiences, because nobody can understand it like somebody who's gone through it. And like I said, the pain didn't want to end. Mary's there. She talks about her children being scarred. Tia talks about how she was arrested at the school gate in front of her kids, and says none of us will get over that. My son was screaming. My daughter was hiding her face in shame. We were all scarred. And she'd been under surveillance for 3 weeks, yet was arrested at the school gate in front of her children. We have to do better. We have to do better. We have to make better decisions where we think about children, and we think about mothers, and we think about the impact of what we do and when we're doing it, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it. We were good. Karen talks about how this new layer of judgment, and how her traumatization kept coming back and kept coming back, and that time after time it would revert back to the level it was when she first got out. Lauren talked about how one officer being there for her had made the difference, all of the difference. Shanice talks about, and I think this is so important as well, it's the little things that get to you, not taking them to school, not knowing how the day's gone, not being able to see what they're wearing, not making their packed lunches. And Shanice carries on saying, you expect to be upset at birthdays and Christmas, not going to parents' evening, you expect that kind of stuff. But she says it's the little things that they miss, that she missed the most. And Margaret talks talks about how the shame comes back and the bad dreams come back, how she can be triggered just by her children asking about something that happened while, as she puts it, she was away. And women talked about dreaming about being separated from their children absolutely for decades. Again, Rita talks about how open and closed conditions made such a difference. Katie talks about how she had a little girl who was in prison, who's now 10 actually, and she still hasn't told her little girl that she was born in prison, that she spent the first 5 months of her life in a prison. And Katie's terrified that when she does tell her, that her daughter will hate her. Where's the support? How do we support women who have these thoughts, who have these worries, who have this need to speak about these fears after they've been released? We just don't. Dee talks about her experience. She survived, and she went to university. I remember her telling me she wanted to go, and she was like, oh, I can't. Was, yes, you can, go, do it. And she got in touch with me, and she did. And this is what Dee says. It was awful. It was shit. It hurt, and I'm scarred. My life was chaotic and complicated before prison. My life as a mother in prison was broken. I've experienced more abuse in my life than most people do in a lifetime. I was an addict. I suffer from nightmares and trauma and depression. All of that is true. But don't just call me complex. Don't just call me vulnerable. I'm strong, but I want to be stronger. I'm free, but I want to be freer. I've moved on, but I want to go further. I want society and services to support me, not just label me. I want people to help me create chances for others, not just give one to me. I don't want to be held back. I want to be driven forwards. So women do survive, but they shouldn't. It shouldn't be this hard. They shouldn't have to go through what they go through to get to where Dee is. So what can we do? What can we do differently? Obviously, I'm going to say that we should absolutely stop sending women to prison as far as is absolutely possible. We should not send pregnant women to prison. There are alternatives. Women do not commit very often violent offences, so there are better alternatives. We need to look to community alternatives. But on top of that, on top of improving social justice so that we stop criminalising women for poverty and trauma, which is what we do at the minute, but we need to look at things. What else can we do? In our research, we can include participants. We can include participants in our methodology. We can include that. We can centralise their voices, centre participants' voices, and recognise that there's not always a discrete break between a participant and a researcher. It's not like two camps. We are all people. We all share experiences, feelings and emotions. There's no difference. We're just, some of us are luckier than others. We need to find a place. Matrocentric just means mother focused. So there needs to be a space in feminism for mother focused research. It has to be embraced and accepted instead of pushed away because it's complicated. Because feminism for years didn't really know how to deal with motherhood, because you have the one mother camp who says, oh, it's biological, I'm better than a dad, I'm marvellous, I'm brilliant. And another who's, if you're a mother, you're accepting oppression of patriarchy. So you'll find complete textbooks on feminist criminology or feminist methodology that don't have anything on motherhood, because sometimes it's just too difficult. I nearly swore I didn't. We have to embrace motherhood, and we have to recognise its power and recognise its value in society, not just in criminology. We need to incorporate feminist principles in research, and that includes things like agency and activism and inclusion and voice and reflexivity, empowerment and challenge. I made a massive decision during my research, sometimes in a PhD. Sorry, I've only got one arm in my glasses. Some people don't release any of their information from the PhD, and they hang on to it like some precious gem and only releases at the end. But that's, your research isn't for you, or this kind of research isn't. It's for the people who are you, who it's with and for your participants. So why would you hang on to it till the end? Get involved, be an activist, be active, and just do something with your research. There are recommendations there for policy and practice. I'm going to just rush through them because I know I can see Vic in the chat telling me I have to stop and I need to get to the next bit, so you can come back and read them. But sorry, I just need to get my mouse to the other screen. Me and technology. So what can we do? What do we do in terms of impact? Like I said, shout loud. I never thought that my family taking pictures of me on the telly would ever come in useful, but it has. Go to Parliament, speak to the news, speak to the media, celebrate your research, shout about it, shout about the harm, shout about what you want to change. Be part of the change that you want to make. I've been lucky enough to be invited to take part in lots of inquiries, in lots of panels, in lots of media articles, but that only comes if people know about your work. So you have to be bold and put it out there and talk about it, develop partnerships. And in applying that knowledge, that's where you make a difference. Already, my researchers, I don't mean to sound like a show off, and that's not why I'm saying it, but it has an absolute impact. For the very first time, there is some guidance for probation officers on the probation officer intranet for supervising mothers. There's guidance for officers to know what to ask. I've done staff training in multiple organisations and locations, in social work with unlocked grads, with some prison officers, with probation officers, with social workers, to get them to think about working differently with mothers in prison. I've worked with PACT to develop programmes for mothers in prisons. We've got the Mothers Inside Out programme that was about to be rolled out before COVID, but will be rolled out again. And I'm developing some partnership working with Sodexo that's going to look at staff training and mothers programmes, educating people who are interested, raising awareness for people who are interested. It all has an impact. You know, I've got a lovely letter off Lord Farmer that says it's had an impact on some of his recommendations, and that's just because you go out and shout about it and you take the mothers' voices out there, you take them with you wherever possible, but when it's not possible, you are their gramophone. And having a responsibility to challenge and campaign and disrupt things and share in dissemination. And the impact is, for me, most important when it happens for the mothers. So one of the mums who attended the Mothers Inside Out programme said, "This was a safe place. I can finally talk about my kids and my guilt without feeling like the black hole is going to swallow me up. Thank you." Sash says, "This course reminded me I'm a mum. Even if I don't see them now, I want to get well for them." Red says, "Just being with the mums and talking about our kids made me feel safer somehow, like I could cope." And Red didn't self-harm for what she said for the whole duration of the course, which was the longest she'd ever gone in prison without self-harming. And she said that was because of the course. Prison officer, "I've been an officer for 16 years and I'll never be the same officer again or say the same things." Bob, prison manager, "It sounds ridiculous now that I know this, but I just hadn't thought of it before. How did we miss this?" Because I'm not talking about rocket science. There's nothing, you know, this is not, you know, rocket science. It's kindness and compassion and mindfulness and recognizing people as people and recognizing motherhood. And Ebony said, "I understand things so much better now. This will help me be a better officer for the mothers. I've got so much more insight and I feel so much more confident to be able to ask about their kids or ask about their motherhood." And what happens if we don't? Beth was sent to prison. When her baby was 4 months old, she was sent to prison for shoplifting, and Beth felt absolutely bereft. She didn't know how to deal with prison. She didn't know how to deal with being a breastfeeding mum in prison with no baby. Social services wouldn't bring the baby to see her because they said she was too far away. So when Beth got out, she hadn't seen her baby for a number of weeks, and she felt the baby didn't know her. And she said, "Every time I feel guilty every time I look at her. She don't want me. She cries as soon as I hold her. And all this does is remind me of how crap I am at everything, but especially at being a mom. On drugs, I can forget it all. When I'm off my face is the only time I can even like myself a little bit. Sometimes I don't want to be here no more. What's the point of me now? I'm not even someone's mom." And Beth, in her interview, said to me that she thought that she would end up back on drugs or back inside. And if only would be my answer, because the tragedy is that Beth took her life. And that's why it's important, because Beth should be alive and her little girl should have a mum. My findings are there. If anybody wants to access them, I can send you them. I can send copies of them. Yeah, that's why it matters. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Lucy. Very powerful, those voices are, aren't they? it's not the first time you've made me cry when I listen to your both your journey and of course the research. How do you stop yourself being angry, Lucy? I know this wasn't a question.
I don't. I spend my life angry.
And do you think that anger has helped you to keep going, or is it something else?
I think anger and passion are both motivating factors, but you can't. I think the important thing about anger is to not allow it to make you bitter, because then you lose sight of what's important. And I'd be no use to the mums if all I did was rant. Trust me, I could. But the mums are angry too. The mums are angry, and you see mums who turn that anger into something positive, and you know, it's a responsibility to do something about it, I think, and that's what comes from the anger and the passion.
You mentioned something I wanted to pick up on about this point of, you know, that the women themselves have an important role to play in changing policy and practice, and that their voices, not only through the vehicle of your research, but the idea of co-production, and that you talked about the wounded healer phenomena and how that empowers them, and these women want change, you know, and has there been anything done about that, or you know, do these women sit at the table with policymakers, or is that very much down to how you bring the women along with you?
I think it doesn't happen enough. I think there are some fabulous individuals who are really passionate about lived experience in leadership roles and lived experience at policymaker level, not just at the consultation level before, you know, after something's all been sorted out and we're about to disseminate, and let's bring some lived experience people to the table. Because I think in the past there's been a tokenism around lived experience, but I do think that's starting to change, and that's starting to change because of the loud voices of individual people who and individual organizations who, like the Prison Reform Trust, and individuals like Paula Harriott, Michaela Booth, Nicola Harding. You know, there are lots of people who use their lived experience positively and challenge when people don't want to listen, or who don't want to recognize its value, and that's important to say. And I think it's important for, you know, I stole food for my children when I was 16 and penniless. You know, I have gone through trauma and poverty, and I think we have to be bolder about saying, you know, I'm no different because I'm now supposedly an academic and a doctor. I'm still that person that went through all of that, and I think we sometimes have this belief that you can't, you know, that anybody who's in academia has never lived that life. Do you know what I mean? I'm kind of in a ramble now, but I think, you know, we can't ever know what other people have experienced, and I don't think we should ever assume that because somebody is supposedly in one camp or another that they've only got that experience. We're all people, and we need to share our experiences without fear of the judgment from other people.
You know, witnessing your journey, Lucy, and certainly how you've talked about it today, we've had lots of comments about, you know, this sort of commitment to feminist research and how you bring that alive, and you're practicing feminist research. We've had one comment from Leicester Cares, so powerful, thanks so much for sharing with us and emphasizing the importance of applying research. So, you know, it's not research for research's sake, it's the application of it, which you do so vividly. We've had lots of congratulations as well, Lucy, with your work. Something that I wanted to pick up on, and somebody commented on this earlier whilst you were talking about grandmothers. Who commented? Just Paula Harriott said grandmothers are so overlooked, which is what you alluded to. Can you say why it's so important to include grandmothers in this debate?
for all of the same reasons that we include mothers, but more so in some ways because they're completely ignored. So there are lots of things that do happen. There are some positive things that do happen in prison, like, you know, child models, or like where mothers are allowed childcare leave to go and visit children at home. But grandmothers wouldn't be included in that because their children are too young. But as a grandmother, you've got the double lay. You've got to worry about your grandchildren and your children, you know, and there are times when your adult children really, really need you. And like that might be when they're having their own children. One of the mothers in my research managed to get home. She managed to get leave to be at the birth of one of her grandchildren, two, I think, actually. And that was really important to her. And if that hadn't happened, that would have been devastating for that family, and would have had an even longer term impact than the impact already has. There was another mum whose grandchild had cancer, but she wasn't given leave. She only got compassionate leave at the point where that grandchild was thought to be terminal, and there was a whole period before that where she was going through an enormous amount, but because she was classed as a grandma, she wasn't able to access things. And when you're a grandma, you've got the intersection of age as well. It's like, you know, you should know better at your age, and people, you know, mothers and grandmothers had that said to them.
Yeah, absolutely. You picked up on and certainly the use of language as well in reference to mothers. A bit of a leap, but Helen Nichols has talked about doing some research about the use of language, and, you know, quite commonly we talk about use of service users, for example. Can you say a little bit more about language, because I think that's a really fascinating.
Well, I really felt strongly. Sorry, Vic, to cut you off. I felt really strongly about using the term criminalised women, and I use that on purpose instead of female offender, because I think if we use criminalised women, that gives us the opportunity to challenge the criminalisation in the first place, and to recognise that because they've been criminalised, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just not as black and white as being labelled as an offender, and the label offender can last for life. Whereas I think being a criminalised woman allows that criticality. And, you know, I think it's really important if we think about language. Anybody who's ever written with me knows I have a real bugbear about these women. I can't stand that term. I hate to see it, because I think, you know, what's wrong with just writing women, you know, or criminalised women? I don't like to see these women. And I do think language is really important. And I think the way we say things, like, you know, like I talked about that officer who said, "You've got 4 children." The way we say things is really important, not just the language that we use.
And that links to that, you know, Thomas Sheff talks about shame being the most powerful emotion, and how much that can drive our behaviours. And you talked about the sort of layering of shame, and if you've got external interactions going on with language that's sort of referred to you, and how that layering is further, you know, deepened through use of language. Absolutely, I can see there's a link between that and shame. We've got another.
Can I just answer one about community-based alternatives? I can see that there, because one of the things that was really, really strong when the women talked about the supervision and support was how important gendered support was, and what a significant role women's centres play in that gendered support. And I think women's centres play a massive part in terms of alternatives to custody, because, you know, women don't need to be sentenced to prison. The very, very few women need to go to prison. And I think we need to, one of the things I would change would be, I would have gender specific sentencing guidelines, and I would have some more accountability built into some of the sentencing decisions that sentencers make. But I think one of the things that sentencers do tend to say is, well, we don't have the alternatives, or we don't have enough alternatives, or we don't know what they are. And I think we absolutely have to expand gendered alternatives to custody, but also gendered support post-release. And I think that would be best achieved by permanent funding for women's centres, permanent funding for women's centre staff, and also women-only teams in probation. I think we should have women-only courts. I think magistrates who, and it is mostly magistrates who sentence women, ought to have far more gender-specific training and knowledge than they currently do, and be required to have knowledge of the gendered alternatives in their community.
Absolutely. So because I've noticed that the Justice Committee have just launched the new inquiry into women in custody. Are you going to be responding to that, Lucy, based on? Yes, good.
Yeah, of course.
So what can our audience do? I mean, some of these questions that Julia was asking about, obviously, things like social work, and you've been involved in, briefing social workers about this issue as well. I know that about your work and social work training. Kerry Louise has asked a new question about the changes in female offender strategy, and obviously the prison expansion program that's going on. What do you think to end then? What messages do you want to send to the Justice Committee, and what can our audience members today do about it?
Well, I think the very last thing we need is an expansion of any prison provision. So I think we absolutely, if we have any new cells because they're there to improve any conditions, then that has to be matched by an equal number of 500 prison cells closed in closed prisons. I don't think I'm naive enough to think that we can stop imprisonment overnight, but we absolutely have a responsibility to reduce it drastically. And prison expansion is not the answer. We need to be sending far fewer people to custody. And I think that's absolutely what we need to be doing. In terms of what we can do as individuals, I think we can educate ourselves. We can be mindful about women's pathways into prison and women's pathways out of prison, and understanding the process of imprisonment, I call it, which starts before criminalisation. And in all of our roles, there'll be people here from police, probation, magistrates, somebody's just spoken, brilliant, and and in the prison, and every one of us has a responsibility to arm ourselves with knowledge and to respond to people with compassion, mindfulness and decency, and definitely to be mindful about the significance of motherhood, and how just to support people and meet people's needs far more effectively than we currently do.
Fantastic. In respect to then these sort of generic codes, do you think then there's a need within the sort of women's delivery of service? You talked very clearly, I think, in your research about the requirement to look at women with a mothering lens, to understand that womanhood isn't just womanhood. Within that we have motherhood. What else is needed then for that?
I think we just have to be we have to acknowledge that when somebody is criminalized, they're not just a criminalized individual. It's like you said, they are everything else as well. And I know we're all in a rush to do our jobs. We've all got jobs to do. And I've been a practitioner, so I'm not naive enough to think that we've got endless time to spend with loads of individuals. But some of the things I'm talking about aren't additional time. It's just about treating people with decency and respect, and acknowledging, what's important to them, and how you can harness that in a positive way, as part of rehabilitation and assistance and avoiding criminalisation.
Are there any for our audience out there? Because we've got a really nice comment from Kerry Louise about saying that this has given her food for thought and fire in her belly for her dissertation. Isn't that wonderful? Are there any lobbying groups or platforms in which we can sort of campaign for this?
There are always, I mean, you know, there are always really vocal charities out there who are doing important work, like Level Up and Women in Prison and the Prison Reform Trust and Birth Companions, and support your local women's centre like Anna Wayman, like New Dawn, New Day and Sunflowers and Trevi. Wherever you are, there will be something around you that you will be able to get involved in, whether that is through support and through donation, or whether that's becoming an active campaigner and challenger, and whatever your political belief in terms of whether you're an abolitionist or whether you just want better services for people, there will be something that you can do. And I think that is really important. We don't all have to have the same view, but we all have to do better.
What next then, Lucy?
Well, I've already started another research project that looks at women's experiences in probation, and I'm also doing some fantastic work with Sodexo that's looking at training all of their officers in relation to working with mothers, and also providing some specialist resources and tools for officers to work with mothers, and hopefully that'll expand into the POAG training and through the public sector as well. So it doesn't end here, it just carries on.
No. Oh, you've been fabulous. As Jenny Oakden has just said, you remain fabulous. And Louise Hobson Cole has just said, I'm training to be a probation officer, and this has really changed the way I think about working with women. How brilliant. Thank you, Louise, for saying that to Lucy. It's given me some insight into what I can do in the future and support them further. Thank you.
And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, please do. Please feel free. I'm more than happy to answer queries or send you more information or whatever you need. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for attending. This will be available to rewatch and recirculate far and wide. Please do get in touch with Lucy. She's a force to be reckoned with, and a campaigner for women and grandmothers, and mothers. Sorry, I meant mothers and grandmothers in prisons and beyond. Thanks again, everybody. We'll be running some more digital seminars for the Prisons and Probation Hub. If you've got any ideas for sessions, I'm happy to chat with you about that. We're very committed here at De Montfort of kind of communicating debates around prisons and probation in a public forum. It's really important to us here. Thank you so much, Lucy, and a huge congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.